This is the American Century Project on America as a World Power from 1945 to 2001, beginning in 1949 with the Chinese Civil War. After the end of the last imperial dynasty of China in 1911, feuds between communists and those that controlled the government were inevitable due to the rising belief in the Marxist ideology. However, tensions between the two were never enough to become an issue until the Sino-Japanese War as the Japanese invaded Manchuria. This was due to the Japanese taking the most prosperous cities in China, causing a lack of funding for defense and eventually a loss of support in the national government. As the Republic of China lost support, communist ideals began to rise in belief as a new solution to their problems. Once the war in both China and across the world had ended, communists within China no longer needed to ally with their enemies inside the nation against Japan, and decided to take action, breaking out into all-out war in 1947 after the revolts began in 1945. Before this, although both leaders had held a conference where both found values that they had agreed upon, such as democracy and justice, mistrust that had been gathering over the years halted any effort to combine the ideals of the parties into one government. As aforementioned, the Civil War had broken out despite U.S. efforts. Some of these, such as General George Marshall making numerous efforts to have the two parties try to come to an agreement, although nothing had seemed to work, were only a few examples. Communists began to even win when fighting back against the official government of China for numerous reasons. One of these reasons being the amount of support for a new government that many had believed would function better than the current one. Another being the massive amounts of firepower that the communists had purely due to the fact that the Japanese left behind so much military supplies after their invasion that the communists were able to use it to their advantage. On October 1st, the Nationalist Party falls, and the People's Republic of China is put in place as Mao Zedong takes control of the government while the remaining officials of the Republic of China flee. This falls under Key Concept 8.1 due to the leadership position that the United States had tried to take during the feuds between the two parties multiple times as we had begun an effort to broker an agreement, leading to the consequences of the two warring. Many consequences resulted from this, such as our efforts to destabilize the new Chinese government. This was due to the fact that we were an ally of the nationalist government after the Japanese attempts on China during World War I. Not only that, but we also continued to support the nationalist government in Taipei after they had fled to Taiwan during the revolution. We then allied with Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea in an effort to create a safety net against China. We also orchestrated the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, or SEATO, that included Thailand, the Philippines, and South Vietnam, as well as the ANZUS Treaty that linked Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, all in an effort to ostracize China, the new communist government, in case anything were to happen that would affect the world. We also employed the wedge strategy, meaning that we were much harder on China than the USSR, their communist rival, to create a bigger divide in their power so that we'd only have to deal with one at a time, the most recent one being China. This also falls under Key Concept 8.1 due to the leadership position that the United States took when siding with the nationalist government that had fled to Taiwan and guided them against the now communist Chinese government, an unstable post-war event. 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Russia, now that the war had been over, saw the U.S. as an opposing superpower that now possesses the most dangerous weapons on Earth. Not only that, but their nuclear power is also growing at an exponential rate that involves the testing and improving of these bombs. Many of these testing sites were located in areas that, if needed, were able to target Soviet soil, such as Turkey and Italy. Jupiter missiles, being highly nuclear, were seen as an offensive threat towards the USSR during the long-standing Cold War between the two. The Soviet Union decided to take a risk and assert themselves defensively through their own usage of highly nuclear bombs and sending towards Cuba. Cuba, having been previously failed and invaded by the U.S., was a strategic point for the USSR to use as their bomb testing and possibly launching center since it was directly next to the United States. These missiles were sent unbeknownst to President Kennedy, and the USSR even lied about having them there multiple times. We then placed a blockade, and although a blockade is military action in order to prevent any ships from delivering more missiles to Cuba, it was not a sign of all-out war, due to it being defensive and not an act against the USSR or Cuba. It relates to 7.3 due to the fact that these conflicts over both territory in Cuba and the offensive acts made by both countries were able to push the U.S. even further into the military and diplomatic spotlight. Many things resulted from this crisis through diplomatic and military action of the U.S. One of these most notable ones being that all nuclear testing above ground was banned, including but not limited to ground testing, space testing, and underwater testing. This was to prevent effects of nuclear radiation that had been plaguing the world since the creation of the first nuclear bomb, causing issues for multiple bordering countries near testing zones. The hotline was a direct phone line from Washington to Moscow in an attempt to prevent any further communication errors between the two superpowers. Intent between both Kennedy and Khrushchev hadn't been fully understood and could have led to nuclear fallout had diplomacy not prevailed earlier. However, although friendly changes had been made, including one emotional letter in the middle of the night by Khrushchev to Kennedy, the war between the USSR and the US had barely wavered. Additionally, and although in secret, Kennedy agreed to slowly remove the missiles from Turkey as to not make the US seem weak, but instead to slowly diffuse the problem between the two superpowers. Fidel Castro, the dictator of Cuba at the time, wished for the Soviets to not back down. Due to this, he was not only unhappy with the United States, but also with the USSR, as he completely resented their decision to remove the missiles from Cuba as their ally. This relates to 8.1 due to the unstable actions made by the USSR in the post-war world, and the US trying to maintain their leadership position by placing missiles in Turkey as a form of assertion, leading to the consequences in the Cuban Missile Crisis. 1979, the Iranian Revolution. The Shah, the previous monarchy before the revolution occurred, had close relations with America to increase the power of Iran, and relied heavily on the US during times of the war, such as the Cold War. That same monarchy implemented a series of reforms that attempted to modernize the country close to the time of the revolution. Khomeini, a clergyman and rebel against the Shah, was exiled from Iran in 1964 due to his opposition of these reforms. However, in February of 1979, he returned from exile to lead their country. After the revolution. The Iranian Revolution relates to Concept 7.2 because Iran was attempting to modernize their country by instituting a series of reforms that angered citizens and caused rebel factions against the monarchy to pop up. Many changes throughout America resulted from this revolution, as listed on the right-hand side. This was due to the fact that the U.S. used to support the previous government, and revolutionaries were supported by communists in the Soviet Union. The relationship between America and Iran changed dramatically. The U.S. embassy in Iran was even attacked, and hostages were taken. Iran wanted to run their own country without the assistance of America, and American citizens were quick to point fingers at who had lost Iran. Some blamed President Carter, and others blamed U.S. intelligence. This relates to the key concept 8.1, as America was attempting to maintain their relations with Iran even after the revolution, and it crippled their national image. 1989, the Tiananmen Square Massacre. In an effort to re-establish relations with the Chinese, as well as discuss topics relating to their governmental issues like Taiwan after diplomatic connections had been cut off since the first event mentioned, the Chinese Civil War, Nixon visited China for 8 days straight. Sadly, no major bounds were made. President Jimmy Carter then decides to reinstate relations with China, as well as recognizing their One China principle, which states that Taiwan is under Chinese rule and the People's Republic of China is the one true government. However, relations with Taiwan are kept, and no embargoes are made. As relations with China increase, relations with Taiwan are still kept, but the U.S. decides not to involve themselves in either side of their conflict and supplies both sides with arms. On April 15th of 1989, students begin to gather in Tiananmen Square in protest against the death of a famed pro-reform leader, as well as numerous issues throughout the Chinese society. The main protest that caught the attention of the Chinese government was the protest of the arrival of Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev on May 15th. The attacks against the protesters were on June 3rd and 4th. After putting martial law in effect to no avail, the PRC sends the People's Liberation Army towards Tiananmen Square, which has now garnered the participation of hundreds of thousands that include workers and ordinary citizens along with the original students. Tanks then rolled over those protesting, and skepticism over the death toll rose due to the secretive nature of the PRC at the time. This background context relates to key concept 8.2, due to the event being a civil rights movement exerting an effort to expand the Chinese government into something new, resulting in political responses that caused the death of hundreds. Numerous things resulted from this, such as much trade with high-ranking Chinese officials had changed, as well as that included, but not limited to, arms dealings being completely halted across America with the aforementioned officials. Many U.S. politicians wanted even more economic trade to be halted with China, and although some word changed, trade was still involved despite the president's public denouncement of the PRC's actions. This left the U.S. diplomatically confused after recently renewing their connections with China after the Civil War that they had had. Led by the U.S., the Group of Seven, being Italy, U.S., Canada, Japan, Britain, France, and Germany, all met at the Houston Summit in 1990, and one of the major points of the discussion was relating to the Chinese political reform based on the treatment of human rights. This relates to key concept 8.1 as the United States responds to an uncertain post-war world and makes an effort to lead multiple countries to discussing the actions of the Chinese government, resulting in an even harsher relationship between the two. Lastly, the attacks on 9/11. This began with the main reason for the attacks being destroying our symbols of power throughout the country. 19 terrorists from the group Al-Qaeda took 4 commercial planes and crashed them into what they had thought that would be the most dangerous symbols of power in America. 2 of these crashed into the upper stories of the north and south towers of the World Trade Center, the third one hitting the Pentagon, and the other one landing in a field. The twin towers later collapsed from the damage. The 4th plane was thought to have headed for the U.S. Capitol building. Al-Qaeda used these attacks to send a message to America. They knew our military was too strong to attack directly, so they opted to use fear as a tool and attack symbolic places in America. The World Trade Center was a symbol of peace in America, and the Pentagon was a symbol for defense. This event falls under key concept 7.3 because there was a conflict over ideologies between the two groups, and we responded with military force, establishing a dominant military, political, and economic position. Many things resulted from this on the attacks on 9/11. The TSA was created in an effort to prevent any event similar to the attacks on 9/11 ever happening again. CIA black sites now created to find and interrogate anybody supposedly associated with Al-Qaeda, including multiple war crimes during torture. AUMF, or Authorized Use of Military Force, used by the Bush administration to hunt down and fight Al-Qaeda in the Middle East, which then spread across at least 14 countries in Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. The Office of Homeland Security is created to protect the United States from future attacks using the current military. And NATO, for the first time, uses its collective defense mechanism and launches a war in the Middle East that lasts nearly 2 decades. About Concept 8.1, after the attacks, America dealt with Al-Qaeda to keep their position of global leadership and make sure that an event like this never happens again. I hope you enjoyed.